you may wonder why she is our guest today. I mean, why, you know, that she's a specialist which certainly would fit into the program, but there was one almost a rule, I can say, that only people not coming from Czech Republic would be guests in our series. But we had some good reasons to invite Miriam Fried. The first and most important is that we would like to hear something about construction grammar from the first-rate specialist. And second, that Miriam, actually she is Czech, she somehow fits into our environment, but she has been for a long time in the United States, so we still can take her as a foreign guest, and we are very happy that we can, because we really wanted to invite you to give us a talk. So please take the floor.
Thank you. Well, thank you first of all for inviting me. I mean, this is really a great honor for me, and for many reasons, but also because I started here actually as a pomviet many years ago, so I still feel that I'm slightly at home. I belong here, but at the same time, talking to you about the things I've been doing ever since I left is a little nerve-wracking, because I don't really address this kind of an audience very often. So we'll see how it goes. Hopefully, you won't find this completely wasteful. Okay, I'm going to talk about an approach to linguistic analysis that I got to know and work with in Berkeley when I first started there as a graduate student. And globally, we refer to this as constructional approaches. It's simply a type of analysis that can be applied to languages, to linguistic work. It's a way of thinking about language and a way of representing speakers' linguistic knowledge. It's motivated or framed by certain very general questions that we all try to answer in our little ways. One question could be stated as, well, how is it that we, that is, we speakers, we language users, know what anything means? When I say something, when you say something, we, without effort, automatically can figure out what's going on. So that's a big question that needs to be answered. How is that possible? Another big question is, then what is the nature of speakers' linguistic knowledge that allows this process of communication and makes us successful in it? And even more broadly, we are interested in searching for answers that can help us figure out the properties of the human mind. And of course, language or linguistic analysis is one type of cognitive behavior that can give us some answers, or that can give us hints about how our mind processes its information, stores it, retrieves it, etc., changes it over time. As I said, there is such a thing as constructional approaches. There is the plural. It's not a monolithic enterprise, but the founder is Charles Fillmore. He developed this originally in the 70s and 80s in Berkeley. It also contains its own semantic theory, which is known as frame semantics. And more recently, people started doing more and more interactional work as well to integrate interactional aspects of linguistic structure. But you'll also run into other names that are associated with constructional analyses. For example, Adele Goldberg, who specializes in issues of argument structure. Bill Croft, who specializes in typological patterning and is much more tightly connected with the cognitive aspects of language. And then on the other end of the spectrum, Paul Kay and his followers, who focus more on issues of formal syntax and are much more closely connected with HPSG, which I assume many of you are familiar with, at least to some degree. Okay, just running quickly through the historical roots of this approach. As I said, in the 70s and 80s, that was a very busy, intellectually very busy time in Berkeley. And there was a lot of cross-disciplinary interest in figuring out what to do about language and how to conduct linguistic analysis that will give us adequately tools for good descriptive and explanatory adequacy. That was simply the question of the day. Particularly people from the circles of psychology and cognitive sciences, which were just starting as a distinct field at that time, but also philosophers and people doing artificial intelligence, anthropologists, sociologists, pedagogy, researchers. It really was a very, very intellectually busy and stimulating time, and so that's where construction grammar really started kind of forming itself. And one of the major concepts that came out of this was the psychological concept of Gestalt, which was kind of transferred or started being used also in the context of linguistic analysis, in the sense that people started being really aware that whatever we do linguistically, we speakers, there is some psychological reality to it, that linguistic categories don't just kind of come into being on their own, or we don't just pick them off the floor, but there is some psychological grounding to it, or cognitive grounding to it, which also raised the question of, okay, what is categorization that we can truly attribute to speakers as being aware of those? I mean, subconsciously, of course, all of that is subconscious. And categories that linguists come up with. Those two need not always be exactly the same thing. The motivation certainly wouldn't be the same. And so what started gradually developing out of this was the so-called holistic approach to linguistic structure, to studying language, and taking the concept of sign as a complex thing, as being the basic unit of analysis, not just in the lexicon, but in grammar as well. And this was particularly interesting, I think, to Chuck Fillmore, who kind of kept pushing that besides all of this, we also have to pay attention to the semantics of bigger chunks of text, which he called text semantics, and that also opened the door for bringing pragmatic aspects into grammatical descriptions. Okay, so if I were to identify construction grammar kind of in the field of linguistic theories, everybody would agree on certain things that are common to both construction grammar and other linguistic theories, namely that language is a learnable cognitive system that is internally structured. That's not a controversial statement. And we also assume that language provides means for encoding and decoding novel utterances. Okay, that's what language needs to be able to do. But in contrast to some formal theories, particularly, I think it's important also for us to keep in mind that construction grammar developed against the background of the prevalent theory of the day in the US, which was transformational grammar. So a lot of these things might seem trivial and kind of, well, of course, we all know the things, but it wasn't at the time when this approach was being formed. Okay, so construction grammar particularly is interested in seeing language as a complex symbolic tool for communication, which definitely would not be true for the generative theory of the transformational type, and that it has a perceptual or experiential basis. That is to say, it does have some psychological cognitive reality to it. And it also takes as a basic assumption, as a given, that speakers rely on chunks of linguistic patterning that they store and retrieve, that the speakers don't create all linguistic structures from scratch just by combining tiny little categories and coming up with something bigger, but that there are really kind of pre-compiled chunks that are available. And so what comes out of this as a basic kind of general assumption that we have to accept for this approach is that grammatical structure evolves from usage, and the usage and the evolution have to be in sync with what we know about cognitive principles that operate even outside of language. So in other words, language is taken as a specific type of cognitive behavior, okay, that nevertheless draws on the general cognitive resources that we have. Methodologically, it's also important to know that it's a kind of inductively oriented enterprise. There's a huge emphasis on empiricism, on using as much authentic material as we can, which of course with the availability of corpora has become a little more manageable and practical. That was not always the case. More and more people also nowadays use sophisticated quantitative evidence in addition to qualitative analysis. And recently also the role of context has become a very prominent issue. Okay, does context play a role in our grammatical knowledge, and how do we represent it, and what of it is conventional, what is not? Okay. Now to tell you just a little bit about the motivation for developing this approach, we have to go really way back, because this is associated with the observation that oh, grammar actually is not just syntax. Even when we are describing syntactic patterns, there is something that we have to say about semantics. And at that time, in the late 60s, the discovery was, oh, we have semantic roles. Ooh. So, which again, against the background of the transformational grammar, this was a huge leap forward. Okay, so what came out of that was that if we are analyzing sentences and their structure, we have to take into account two layers minimally. We have to, Fillmore at that time talked about case frames on the one hand and valences on the other, and one developed into what nowadays is known as construction grammar, and the other one frame semantics. That is, we have the layer of a sentence structure, and we also have the layer of the information that comes with the words that fill the slots of the structure. And originally, I think people started mainly noticing things that were funny. They were weird, in that sense, funny. So structures that were kind of productive, but not completely productive. So what do we say about those? Are they really part of syntax, or are they part of lexicon? Another motivating factor was how words actually combine in context, because sometimes we actually notice constraints. Things don't just go together because we think they should. And then also the issue of categoriality. That is, where do we draw the lines between linguistic categories? And the observation was that, well, it's pretty difficult very often. So the fluidity in that was a problem. I'm just going to give you now two quick examples of the first two problems, and then the second half of my talk will talk more about the categorial issues. Okay, so partial productivity. Let's just imagine that every English speaker has to know that there is such a thing as what we could call as an pattern. Okay, here we have two examples. Jack is as old as my brother. Jack is as fat as an ox. In both cases, and I'm sorry, the formatting worked on my computer a lot better than here, so I can see it's going to be a mess. But in both cases, what we see is as, then we have a slot for an adjective, as, and a slot for a noun. But then when we start actually looking at it more closely, we realize that the first one has a little sense. It has to be interpreted as comparing Jack with some other entity along a property that is expressed by the adjective, which is not the case in the second example, where we have a figurative reading. We are not comparing Jack to some specific instance of an ox that I can point to, but just as a category. So there is a difference in interpretation. But then we start noticing other things. For example, Jack is as old as my brother is perfectly okay. We can add to this pattern this is at the end. We can also drop the first as. Jack is fat as an ox. But we cannot, oh God, this is really bad. We cannot add is in the fourth example. So that what follows is that we seem to have two formal little signals that something is going on. One is that for the literal meaning, we can add the is, but for the figurative meaning, we can leave out the as. So there's a blank. Okay. Therefore, we are not too surprised that we cannot say this. Jack is old as my brother is. We cannot combine those two because there is a conflict between the two readings. So we have a pattern that looks kind of the same throughout, and yet it's not the same. We have at least two readings here, and something needs to be done with it. Oh man. Okay, imagine that this N is after as. What software is this? I mean, which edition of PowerPoint is this? Sorry. Okay, just imagine that we can say, okay, there is a pattern as N, and it's a very open one. It can have any kind of reading. But if we add is to it, and the N is definite, then we get the literal meaning and nothing else. If we leave out the first as, and the N is marked as indefinite, which it has to be, then we have the figurative reading. So we have a kind of family of related constructions that we have to say, aha, speakers really know that there is this general kind of thing that can be manipulated, stretched in different directions, but the stretching has strings attached. There is a different interpretation that goes with it. This is scary. Okay. So that's a case where we have a sort of productive pattern, but still constrained. There are certain things we have to say extra beyond just saying as A, as N. And then the other type is the combinatorial problems, which we can take just a very quick example from English. We have adjectives like tall, heavy, old, dark, etc. We can mark a certain degree on a scale and say something is very tall, very heavy, so we can modify it by a degree modifier. We can do it for other adjectives as well, very tired, very tasty, very interesting, very large. But notice that when we take synonyms of these, we don't necessarily get the same result. We don't say very exhaustive, very huge, very famished. Instead, we say absolutely famished, absolutely huge, absolutely delicious. And that has to do with a semantic feature of these adjectives. Some simply mark a degree on a scale, others mark the end of a scale. And this difference in their scalar behavior actually has consequences for syntactic behavior. Therefore, we have to take it into account. Therefore, even for combining degree marker with an adjective is not just combining a degree marker and an adjective. There is more that speakers evidently have to be aware of subconsciously. So, anyways, just based on examples like this, the conclusion is that patterns grammatical patterns in the inventory of any speaker of a given language really form a continuum that goes from the prototypically lexical things that we would traditionally call lexical to what we would prototypically call grammatical or syntactic. So on the one end, on the really kind of lexical or fully semantic end, we would have constructions or patterns that are fully fixed lexically. We can't replace anything in Blue Moon if that's what we mean. I mean, the idiom, by and large children, etc. That's just how it is. But then there are cases in which we have lexical filling, like go postal cannot be anything but go postal as an idiom, and yet part of it is actually flexible, is syntactically changeable in that it takes tense, marking, and person, and mood and such. Then we have constructions like as A, as N, in which we have, okay, here for example we have 4 slots, 2 are filled lexically, we cannot move anything about that, I mean that's just done. But then we have 2 open slots, one for adjectives, one for ends, and that any member of a given class can be used in there. So that's kind of partially filled, partially idiomatic, partially truly productive syntactically. And then we have the other end of the continuum in which we have truly, fully schematic constructions, grammatical, such as verb phrase constructions or subject predicate, and at the morphological level, other things. So, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious. But this is important to know, that these things are really treated as on a continuum, as opposed to saying, okay, this is lexicon and this is grammar, and there is a big Chinese wall in between, because that's very difficult to find that wall. Okay, so now I introduce the notion construction, or the term construction. So for construction grammar, construction is not what we traditionally mean by when we say construction, that is as a syntagmatic string. It's a theoretical entity. It really has a very specific technical status and technical properties. Namely, it's taken as the basic unit of analysis, which can apply to any linguistic sign of any internal complexity, or size. So it can be morphological constructions, that is complex words, it can be phrases, it can be clauses, terms, etc. It is taken as a symbolic sign, that is as a conventional, otherwise unpredictable association between form and function, something that speakers cannot predict or guess from anything else they know about their language. It's something that cannot be further divided, in other words. And it's a multidimensional object. In other words, in any given construction, we may be specifying form, meaning, and I mean really lexical meaning, syntactic function, pragmatic aspects, phonological, prosodic, I mean whatever happens to be the idiosyncratic feature of a given linguistic unit. It's not universally given. And constructions are the things that license well-formed linguistic expressions. They are basically recipes or kind of blueprints for creating and decoding linguistic expressions. Now, to summarize major features of this approach, there are at least 4 things that I think you should know. So one is that there is also a disciplined and I mean consistently made distinction between constructions as an abstraction, as an emic part of linguistic structure, and construct, which is the actual linguistic material in which we speak. In other words, we don't speak in constructions, we speak in constructs. Okay, and here is a little example. If I take a sentence like this, can I change the reservation that my colleague made? This does not represent a construction. And this is not a construction. This is a construct, this is a sentence, which is licensed by a whole bunch of constructions that are recycled elsewhere in the language. So they are not specific to this particular expression, they just are pieces of grammar that kind of sit in our brain and can be combined and recombined and embedded in various ways. So here we have a subject auxiliary inversion construction, which is responsible for the switching of the can and I in a question, and not just this kind of switching, it can be other kinds of switching. We have an example of a restrictive relative clause, which is the yellow chunk. We have two instances of a subject-predicate construction. So a nice one is the one that I underlined. The other one would be messier, but it's the whole sentence, actually. Then we have two instances of a determination construction. The reservation and my colleague represent another type of construction. Then we have two cases of a transitive linking construction, because we have two transitive verbs, and these constructions are responsible for making sure that the valence elements get their appropriate instantiation in a sentence. And then we have two cases of a verb phrase construction, because we have two transitive verbs, etc., etc. And then we have even the lexical constructions that some people insist on calling individual words. Okay, so that's yeah, I'm not too happy about it, but it's there. Then another thing is that each construction is analyzed actually in two layers, or in two kind of domains. One is we need to know what a construction consists of. So there are pieces that form a larger unit, and that's the internal properties, the internal structure. But the chunk together, I mean, the combination has, by definition, also its own function or its own meaning, something that we cannot just read off of the parts. So this is the difference between the internal structure and the external properties of a construction. I'll give you another quick little example. So in English, we know we can say the window, much snow, my car, the washers, mud, and many other such things, but we cannot say just car, like I have car, or much window, or much windows, a snow, and a lot of other things that I'm sure you can fill in. So, what does that mean? It means that, and this is totally abbreviated, very kind of brutally abbreviated representation, we know that we have a structure that consists of two things. One we could call a determiner, the other one we could call a head noun, and there are certain agreement features that have to hold between them, and I'm just not listing them, but number and configuration and all those things. And we know that together, just intuitively and traditionally, they form a determination phrase. Okay, so this combination gives us a determination phrase. Okay, that's great, but here's a little problem. We have sentences like, he fixed the washer in a week, but we don't say he fixed washers in a week, and we can say he couldn't clear much snow in such a short time, but we wouldn't say he cleared snow in such a short time. In other words, what is okay is when we have an instance of this determination pattern. We have a determiner and a word and a noun working okay in describing certain types of events. But what is not okay is when we have just a bare plural or a normal mass noun without any determiner in this describing the same type of pattern. And notice what the type of event is. It's a completive event that says, okay, something took place within a certain time unit that is specified, and when we reach the end of the time unit, the thing was done. In Czech, this would be done through aspect, but in English, which doesn't mark aspect the same way, this actually is reflected in how the nominal is shaped in order to not create a semantic conflict. So I can say I fixed the washer in a week, because in that sense, the washer is treated as a discrete entity that is bounded, has boundaries, and when I reach the end of the event, the boundary is reached also within this unit. But if I say washers, he fixed washers in a week, that simply is not a possibility, because there is no boundary expressed by the bare plural. So what we have to say is that actually it's a property of the combination that the result is something that is bounded, conceptually bounded. And what's even more important is to say that that's not something we read automatically off of the properties of the constituents, because the boundedness is not a condition of the pieces. I mean, much or snow are inherently conceptually unbounded, right? I like snow. Well, I'm not saying this snow or that snow, just snow as a type of substance. So it's not, it would be minus minus. And yet when we add them, we don't get minus. No matter what is in the internal structure, the end result, the raison d'etre, I would say, of the determination construction is that it marks a bounded entity. So here we see that the external properties are not necessarily in sync with the internal properties, and that's why it's a construction. We have to say both things, because on the internal level we are just concerned with what we are observing as a piece. But on the external level, we are saying, oh, okay, when I want to plug this into something bigger, there are certain constraints I have to obey. And that's where the external properties become important. So that's that. And what follows is that constructions, by definition, are non-compositional. In other words, they are not just sum of their parts, but there's always something extra that the construction adds. And as I already said, that also gives us the fact that we can kind of move along the continuum fairly freely. Okay, not all constructions do the same things. So just briefly again, we have constructions that we can just call lexical constructions, and those are lexical units, and we can say things about them if we are interested. Then we have constructions that are responsible for the relationship between the valence and its instantiation in syntax. So those are the so-called linking constructions. Then we have phrasal constructions, like the determination, where we are actually putting multiple pieces together and a bigger phrase happens at the end. And it's very possible that we can say that there is a subtype of these phrasal constructions that have to do with ordering elements if a language has particular constraints that need to be specified. So that it's just to let you know that it's not all one size fits all, that there are different jobs that are distributed over these things. And since I mentioned the external-internal mismatch and the fact that the constructions are non-compositional, there is a term that everybody uses a lot, and people keep talking about constructional meaning this and constructional meaning that, and it's not always quite clear what it is. So I'm just going to give you a few examples to give you a hint of why we talk about it that way. So certain constructions will have an idiomatic kind of lexical meaning, like the rich, the famous, the affluent, the poor. Okay, we know what that construction means. It's not just adding the and poor, for example, and so, okay, there is a meaning that goes with this particular combination. Then it could be simply a syntactic function, like in the determination construction. What is idiosyncratic, what is special, what is the constructional meaning is really the determination function. That's what that combination, that's what that phrase does. And then it could also be a pragmatic function, which is something entirely different. And here is a nice example. Why didn't you become the leader? Why don't you become or be the leader? When we compare these two things and start thinking about it, we make a lot of interesting observations. One is, okay, we can have an example. Why don't you wear shoes? That can have, and I don't actually want to give it a prosody because that betrays the meaning. But anyways, if you just see this, this has inherently two possible readings. It could be a genuine question. Oh, I notice you are barefoot, so why is that? Don't you have any shoes? Why don't you go and get some? But it can also be, well, why don't you wear shoes if you complain that you are cold? Which means, well, go get your shoes. Don't complain to me. Go get them. So it's not a genuine question. It's more like a suggestion saying, okay, well, yeah, you have a problem, so here is a solution. In the second example, we only have one interpretation. Why don't you have any friends? That is just a genuine question, because we cannot just say, well, go and have friends. Right? So obviously there is something going on there. In example number 3, why don't you try something else tomorrow? That also has just one interpretation, meaning, well, go and try something else tomorrow. Whatever you did today failed, so go and do that. And 4 also, why don't you be the one in charge, can only be read in one possible way. Well, you take the leadership. Okay, you keep kvetching, so go do it. So what do we make of this? Well, we have to start, I mean, when you are faced with a bunch of data like this is what you do. You start looking at the individual features that tell us where the two forms, or the one, seemingly one form actually starts splitting into two different constructions. So on the one hand, it all looks like a normal WH question with an inversion, and specifically with the WH word why. Okay, that's common to all of them. But then we also notice that the ones that have the funny interpretation look like normal imperatives. I mean, in English we say, don't be a fool, don't go barefoot, don't do such and such. So it looks like a normal imperative, even though it looks like a question also. There is a conflict in polarity, because we can say, why don't you try something else tomorrow? And yet, after a negative verb, we really should not have some. We should have the any series of pronouns. So there's a little bit of a problem. It seems that we can only find this in the past tense and possibly maybe in the future, but certainly not in the present tense. I'm sorry, we typically find it in the present tense, definitely not in past, and maybe a little bit in the future. It always has to be negative. It's not why do you be the leader is not a possibility. And as I said, we are actually shifting to a different speech act. We are not talking about a question anymore. We are talking more about an attenuated order. And if I do this constructionally, this is what it looks like. Okay. So we have two pieces, yes, why as the beginning of a WH question, and then we have the rest of the sentence, which is a basic subject-predicate construction. But the subject-predicate construction also recycles two other pieces that can just be plugged in from other parts of the grammar. One is the subject-auxiliary inversion construction, which says, okay, I need the verb do. It has to be negative, it has to be in the present tense, and only in the contracted form. It cannot be why do you be the leader, but why do you not be the leader, but it can only be why don't you be the leader. And then we have the inverted subject. And I'm sorry, I'm covering this for you. And then we have another part that basically looks like a normal English imperative without the subject inside of the imperative, except that it has to be positive, and it has to be a verb that actually suggests something we can act out. And when we put all of this together, we get something that does not come out of adding these pieces, namely that we have a different speech act. So it's only the combination of all these features that tells us, oh, we are not asking a question anymore. We are telling you to do something. So all of these are things that are part of this big construction. Some are inherited from other constructions, like the subject-auxiliary inversion, for example, but some are idiosyncratic to this combination, and that's the ones that I marked in blue, if you can see it. So those are the special features that don't come automatically out of knowing all the other things about it. Okay, so to conclude this general part, construction grammar really has one major ambition in life, which is to develop analytic tools and representational tools that would allow us to articulate as realistic representations of speakers' linguistic knowledge as possible, which also include their communicative competence, not just the fact that they can put words together and create clauses. And the idea is to be as accurate in the detail that needs to be somehow captured, but at the same time not to give up on generalizations. We still want to be able to, when we see a bunch of data, to come up with some kind of a general pattern construction that says, okay, so this is the general knowledge that speakers have, and that's what they manipulate further. Okay, and now I will go to a little case study that kind of illustrates one of the really big problems that every linguistic theory has to cope with, which is that categories are not categorical very often. That most of the time there is a sliding scale of what is a member of this category or that category. For example, in English, I mean, a classic example is if I ask you mountain, okay, the word mountain, is it a noun or is it an adjective or is it something else? Or if I say up, okay, what is up categorially? And it's tough to say because it just depends on where, in what construction we find it. If I say a mountain road, mountain looks like an adjective. If I say this is a tall mountain, then mountain is a noun, right? So this is the gist of the problems that everybody has to cope with. But I prepared something totally exotic for you, and hopefully we'll just run through it successfully. Okay, because I am basically a diachronic linguist at heart. I mean, that's what I started as an undergraduate student and always on and off pursued in various ways. But construction grammar made it easier for me because since it allows the fact that language is in flux constantly, then I don't have a problem whether I do synchronic analysis or diachronic analysis. I'm constantly dealing with changes, with shifts. So synchronically we are looking at variability, diachronically we are looking at change that we can actually pinpoint, but it's really basically two sides of the same coin. So I'm happy I can combine these two things. Okay, and the specific example I want to run through here is the so-called long present active participle in Old Czech. I'm really not talking about present-day Czech. That's important to keep in mind. Don't extrapolate. And I want to establish A, how they developed categorially, and B, how to cope with the fact that some of them are formed regularly the way we would expect them to be formed, and some of them are not. Okay, so one question that I'm asking myself is, if I find an irregular case of this long present active participle, does it mean that I also should expect an irregular meaning, or does it really not matter? What is it that motivates the irregular formation, and can I somehow stick it into the general system, or do I have to say, well, tough, I can't really, I don't know, under the table, I'm not going to talk about it, funny exception. And then how can I relate them to the regular forms if I can? In other words, can I create a coherent system, or is it a mess? And this is the corpus that I used for it, and I'm going to skip it now because I don't have that much time, but if you are really curious, I can tell you later. Okay, so the data that I'm looking at. There are regularly formed long present active participles, which I call participial adjectives, simply because of their form, and they are part of the verbal paradigm. Okay, and this is what they look like. So we have a root that gets a suffix attached that marks the present tense as opposed to past or passive, and then we have a suffix that marks the participle itself. So up to here we have the short participle, like nesut. And then we add the case number gender portmanteau suffix, which actually creates the adjective. So that's the whole form, and it would be something like one verbing. And here we have specific examples. So if we take the root nes, and we add the present suffix u, and then we have the participial suffix ц, then we have nesut, and to that we add the e, which is always a marker of this adjective, and altogether we have something like one carrying. Okay. From a different verbal class, we may have the root vis, and then we add ie, and then ц, and we get visiací, one hanging. And from yet another class, we may have the root žád, which takes aju as the present tense marker, and then we have again the participial stuff and the cng, and we get one requesting. Okay. So that's the regular stuff. Then there are irregularly formed things that I call pseudo-PAs, and this is what happens. We may find a root that comes from a particular morphological class, like this, but then we add something to it that looks a lot more like what we normally associate with a different morphological class. In this case, the uju, aju, yeju, etc. So the question is, what does this mean? Is it just a mistake, or is there actually something going on? Another example would be to take the root from the third class, žád, and what we add to it is something that normally we associate or find with the first class only. So again, there is this mixing and matching, and the question stays. Okay, so does this mean the same as žádající, or is there a difference? And what I might also add is that later we even find these endings with adjectival roots. So there really is something about these ujuts, uds that just suddenly take their life off, and I mean they just go on their own path and do other things. And what's also important to note is that I have not run across a single attestation yet in which this irregular combination would be part of the short participles. And that's uncontroversial. I mean, everybody agrees, yeah, this somehow has to do only with the adjectives. There's something funny going on. Once we start making this adjective out of the verb, all kinds of things can be happening. Okay. So, how do we cope with this? Well, traditionally, the analysis has been based on the assumption that if we want to trace a change, we have to look at the form, and the form itself somehow gives us answers about what and how changed. And the other assumption is that there really is reliable isomorphism between form and meaning, and so, okay, if it's an irregular form, there's something else going on. And typically, the irregular form has been suggested to have to do with metaphoric transfer. So, okay, these irregularly formed things would simply be metaphorically different, and that's all there is. And the evidence comes from examples like these, where we find vrúci, which literally means one boiling, but it means something like heartfelt, or spající, which literally would mean the one sleeping, but it's used figuratively as latent. Okay, but when we actually look at the texts, when we look at how these forms are used, we find something entirely disturbing. One is that the metaphorical examples are extremely uncommon, so there's not much that rides on this analysis. And typically they are restricted to specific lexical items. Then we also find that both the regular and irregular tend to serve the same function, so there's a big overlap between them. And we also cannot say that one is obviously older than the other. We get both of them from the very beginning. And the irregular formation is fairly productive. It's not just individual cases here and there, but there are lots of verbs that actually allow both formations, and so we can just kind of dismiss it. Therefore, I would say if the pseudo-PA, the irregular form, systematically differs from the regular form, then the irregular formation must be sensitive to certain patterns of usage and involve specific kinds of interaction between syntax and morphology, just like the regular ones. And then the question is, so where are the differences, or are there any? Okay. And just by way of giving you some general background that is good to know, is that the part of speech system in Old Czech was quite different from what we know in present-day Czech, namely that we definitely had verbs and nouns as established categories that we can tell the difference. But this is not the same for adjectives, which were only emergent. They really mostly were reliably taken in certain contexts, but they were not a fully formed lexical class of its own, grammatical class of its own, which concerns not just the PAs, but adjectives in general. And the morphological system also was slightly in flux, so there was a lot going on, which the poor speakers had to deal with. And so why do I bother with PAs, which seem so exotic and kind of, you know, why bother? Well, because they are part of a much more general process of establishing a new class of lexical items. So that's a big question. And we have the extra advantage that they are morphologically complex, so we can actually see the tiny little partial transitions that usually are required for a big change that we can then perceive to happen. Okay, so it gives us kind of extra material to work with. So I'll start with just a quick survey of the formal ones, which I have done quite a bit of work on, so I'm not going to go through all the arguments, just take my word for it that I have done the work. They can be used as actor nouns, as in věřící meaning věřitel, okay. But I'm not going to talk about those, that's a whole other lecture. But they are also found in contexts in which they obviously serve as secondary predicates. For example, když opět z Kerchova jdéše, uzřel opět ďábla sebou chodícího, where the underlined part is the subject of the participial adjective, because it is a verbal form, so it still has its subject, and we have the picture. Okay, he goes around along the Kerchov, and there is the devil also walking along with him. So these two events are happening at the same time. But then we also find contexts, quite a few, in which we have to say this is used attributively. This PA is not a secondary predicate. It modifies a nominal entity, as in ať patříme na tvoj kající život a následujeme tebe, which in literal sense would be repenting life, but it really means life full of repentance. So we are just qualifying the kind of life. We are not talking about two events happening at the same time. And it turns out that the critical criteria for mapping this shift from the original predicative sense to the attributive one follow several lines of analysis. One is linearization. It really does matter where these things happen. So one possibility is that the PA and its subject are right next to each other, or they are separated by additional material. So that's one criterion that matters. Another one is whether the participle precedes or follows its subject. That also turns out to be relevant to the development from predicative to attributive. Another criterion is animacy of the subject. In the old layers, it's 99% of the cases that the subject is animate, an animate entity, and typically human on top of that. Later we find lower individuation, also inanimate entities, and ultimately even abstract nouns. So there is a very nice chronological line that shows that something happened along the animacy scale. And even though this is less decisive, still we find evidence that root semantics had to do with that as well. Again, along a nice chronological line that in the old examples, it always is formed from an active root, a verb of action. Gradually, verbs of states start being incorporated, and ultimately we even find these so-called psych predicates like verbs of cognition and experiences and such things. Okay. So there is a development. We can see that these criteria shifted the form from the verbal domain to the adjectival domain. And I'm now going to focus on the linearization because that seems to be really, really, really important. There are three patterns. One is such that the subject comes first. Then we have a participial clause such that the participle is at the end, and whatever non-subject complements happen, they are in between. Then we have a linearization in which the relative order is still the same, but the subject and its participle are right next to each other. And then we have the pattern C in which they are still next to each other, but the order is switched. Okay? So the PA comes first. It may have its complements, but it doesn't have to, and then the subject comes last. So I'm going to take now these three patterns and show you how it correlates with the other criteria, which is the animacy and the complementation. Okay, so I think I'm gonna skip these numbers because it doesn't really matter that much. I can tell you later. It's just to show you that I'm not making it up. It's actually there. But this is what I really want to show you. Okay. How one can use the constructional approach to it to model what actually goes on dynamically, because that is the toughest part, right? We can, in any theory, we can really describe the state that holds here and the state that holds there and then say, oh, okay, so there's a difference in ABC between these two states. But it's really good to be able to show how the imperceptible little changes actually add up to the big change that we can then identify. So if we start with the regular formation, this is what we have. It's an inflectional form within the verbal paradigm that consists of two major pieces. One is the nominalizing suffix, which expresses the case number gender, and then we have the verbal stem, which consists of three pieces, right, as we talked about it. The root, which prefers the verb of action, a verb of action, then we have the present stem extender, and then we have the participial suffix. Okay, so this is our form that we started with. Plus, we have to say that it expresses active voice and contemporaneous tense, and it will look for its subject someplace outside of this form, and there is a kind of surviving, in remnants surviving, pragmatic function of contrastedness, and we are not going to be concerned about it. But then morphologically, what the irregularity has to do with is the following. There is a kind of fusion of these two things that are next to each other. It seems that they form one ending that then becomes alive on its own and diminishes certain verbal properties of the form. So the form is funny. It's not fully verbal anymore, and yet we should be finding it as a secondary predicate. Okay, so how do we resolve this tension? And here is how it gets resolved. If I take the first linearization, subject first, non-subject complements, and then the participial adjective. This is the form I just showed you. It's just shrunk. Okay, so this is the regular form the irregular form of the participial adjective, and this is the contextual environment. Okay, we have the subject, which is animate. Then we have the non-subject complements that follow, and then we have the PA. And the way it functions is that this really looks like a clausal structure, basically, because we have all the complementation. It's just a distinct form for expressing a secondary predicate. No big deal. That's just normal, regular stuff. Funny thing happens when we switch the order, when the non-subject complements are actually postposed after the participial adjective. When we find this configuration, the animacy becomes, the animacy still sits there, but the verbal semantics seem to be relaxed. This is the environment in which we suddenly start seeing non-active predicates. Okay, so that's an interesting observation. But it's still sort of possible to be interpreted as a secondary predicate. But then if there is no non-subject complement, when we have just these two pieces, this is the configuration in which in text we find that the subject is typically non-animate and the verbs can be anything. Okay, so we can see two pieces that are relaxed at this point. So it becomes much more like a nominal structure, looking like normal modification constructions that existed in the language. So, and it is interpreted as attributive. I mean, speakers obviously infer something else. And then when we switch the order and have the last linearization where the subject follows, this is the place where we practically do not find an animate entity. So the animacy is completely gone, and preferably we even find verbs of states. So these two criteria are completely relaxed, and this is only interpreted attributively, and that actually analogically is attracted to the unmarked, the most common modification phrase, structure that existed in the language then. So we really shifted syntactically someplace completely different, and semantically also. These actually acquire different interpretations, such as a tak obecně všecky učíše, aby od vidoucích i od tělesných věcí oddálili sebe. Where literally we are looking at things that see, but really it means things that are visible, that can be seen. So there's nothing active about this. This is Billis, right? Or purpose phrases. I vyvedli na cestu pravou, aby šli v město bydlící, where it's literally the place that is living, but really it means place for living. So there is a really major syntactic shift. Okay. So to summarize all of this, the syntactic function correlates with the syntactic organization linearly. I mean, the syntagmatic environment is really crucial. Animacy of subject, which sits outside of the form, and verb semantics. And the shifted meaning correlates with syntactically most truly modification constructions in the language. So there is a precedent that just kind of sucks it in and then forces it to lose certain properties. And there are interesting observations about case marking. And I am just going to run through this picture. I'll tell you what this means. What really surprised me was that the irregular formation from the beginning was only or is only attested in vocatives and nominatives, which are quintessentially nominal entities, right? We are not attributing any doings to vocatives and nominatives, which is just the opposite from the regularly formed PAs, which originally started showing up in accusatives and oblique cases, because that again cognitively makes sense, because and pragmatically too, because we are describing the unknown entities that we talk about in some bigger way, whereas the agent, the nominative, the subject, that's typically a human being. We don't need to know much about them. That's a given, right? So there's a huge contrast even in the syntactic function that we find between these two. And so I find that really actually very interesting that we can pinpoint down all these little details. So what do I conclude from all of this? What happened in the process of gradually fixing the completely fluid and context-dependent functional load of this form to fixing it as a real adjective? Well, first of all, it's not a direct correlate of the morphology. Okay, regular, irregular, it doesn't matter. Second of all, we have to take into account the interaction of the item itself, which sends certain signals, and the larger pattern, which sometimes sends completely conflicting signals, and the tension has to be resolved. So we may end up with a new pattern completely. We may also just adjust existing patterns in both directions. And so we can see that the internal structure of the pseudo PA also got reorganized, and that the syntactic behavior then gets fixed and pushed in a certain direction. So I'll skip through this quickly too, because that you don't need to worry about this. But diachronic linguists really now are concerned about what we call these things. So what kind of a change is this? And we would want to say, well, it's constructionalization in the sense that we are creating a new chunk that recycles something old, pushes it in some direction, and sets it in there. And analogy is the driving force of this. But what I want to get to is, as the last kind of little piece that I want to show you, is that I think that this also gives us a good argument for saying that grammar is not just a list of things. Grammar is really a bunch of networks of constructions that are somehow related to each other, and that we can identify how they are related. So if I take this purely diachronically, I can say, okay, so we have the secondary predicate, we have the habitual attributive transitional stage, and then we have the real adjective. The regular PAs cover this part of the functional space, and the irregular forms cover that part of the functional space, so we can see the overlap. And what's funny is that the metaphor really sits only in that little corner there. It covers only a very small part of this. And the linearization goes very nicely, actually, from the truly clausal to the truly modificational. And if I did this in a constructional representation, this is what it would look like. Okay, we identify first the properties that are crucial. So complementation, voice, the class, the semantic class of the verb, subject, the adjacency, the postnominal, prenominal, and tense. And then we can attach the properties that go with it. So if I take the predicative part, this is what it looks like. It has to have complements, it's active, it's animate, it's adjacent, it's prenominal preferentially. If I take the transitional, it kind of goes almost in the opposite direction. It's typically bare, it's active or stative, lower individuation. It's definitely adjacent. That's a very clear signal, and prenominal. And then if I add those really shifted meanings, the resultatives and the billies, those are the ones that really are not active anymore. They lost even that part of the verbal property. And those we can finally call adjectives. I wouldn't even still categorize the other ones as adjectives. And I don't know if you'll see this, but it's the subject and the adjacency and the postnominal. Those are really the driving properties. And when we map the irregular forms on it, this is what we get. This is a big territory for the irregular formation. And if it ever occurs as a predicative, it really has to go overboard with being active and having an animate subject. So in other words, it kind of makes up, compensates for the fact that it's morphologically really bad as a verb. So it goes outside and says, well, okay, if these are true, then I can still be an adjective. I can still be a verb, secondary predicate. And the metaphor would, again, fit only in there. Okay. So is construction grammar and model relevant to synchronic variation and diachronic change? Well, you bet it is. Otherwise, I wouldn't be telling you all this. Because it allows us to make the distinctions between the holistic view and the little pieces inside. It really does give you a pretty fine-grained tool to trace the individual little pieces that are so gradual that we wouldn't perceive them as speakers, but ultimately we see the end result. So the incremental nature is what is the challenge, and that's what construction grammar is good for. Then also, because constructions are multi-layered and they are clusters of properties, we can manipulate the pieces of the cluster. And because it doesn't ever expect, the approach that everything will be filled in perfectly, then we can also trace the larger diachronic shifts in which we have blanks here and there. And the mismatches between the external and internal is something that is crucial to tracing variability and change. And ultimately, the last thing that I would want to say is really important. Change does not originate in a single property, and certainly not formal or syntactic. It's always the semantic and pragmatic environment that triggers the potential for new inferences, and once the inferences take, then form will follow. And that I think is really crucial. Thank you.
So I think for many of us it was quite novel. So I just would be very happy if people can ask questions even then. Yes, Sasha?
The general part. I was wondering about the notion of sign. What's if this has any theoretical status in construction grammar, and if so, what's the relation between sign and construction, or between sign and construct? So my naive interpretation is that constructs are signs, and constructions would be constraints on signs, if I could translate it into HPSG language. And so that's the first question. And the second question is, I was wondering if really every construction has non-compositional, or has to have non-compositional meaning. So I wasn't sure about this.
Yeah, these are, of course, the two toughest questions. They go right to the core. So, I mean, thank you, because these are really interesting, important. And once we understand these two, then I think we do understand the gist of construction grammar. So, the first one, I don't think that construction grammarians ever bothered to really work out in detail how these terms relate to each other, whether inside construction grammar itself or across to HPSG. The general agreement is that the two approaches, or the two types of analysis, are very similar and share a lot of features. One of them, the basic one, being that both believe that the basic unit of analysis is quote-unquote sign. Okay. I think that the way you put it would be pretty accurate. That the way I learned construction grammar, it was always that, okay, constructions are signs. But they were meant in the abstract sense that, yeah, of course, constructions are constraints, essentially. Constructions, well, you'll hear also, okay, so constructions are signs. Constructions are constraints on the possibilities of linguistic combinations and creating linguistic and interpreting linguistic expressions. And constructions are hypotheses about the linguistic knowledge that speakers have. Now notice that these three really are not necessarily on the same level. So, you know, everybody puts a slightly different content in them, but I think ultimately we still mean the same things. Whether we call it constraints or hypotheses or signs, there is an abstraction. And that's a construction. And to me, that is the same thing as what HPSG would call constraints on signs. That is the big picture, right? With the big brackets around it. And then these things are instantiated in real communication, and whether we call them constructs or signs or linguistic expressions, personally, I don't really care that much as long as we are clear what we mean by that. But still, you know, maybe a historical note is in place here. The term construct didn't start from the beginning. That is a fairly recent kind of addition, precisely because people realized, well, okay, we have to make a distinction. Because then there was a lot of confusion about what a construction is, right? So, again, terminologically, I don't really care what we call it as long as we keep this distinction that you described. So if that helps, that's how I see it. Yeah.
I actually heard construct from you for the first time.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah. No, it's been around for a little bit, but not
very
long.
literate in construction grammar. So.
But that's, you know, because also there is a branch of construction, I don't want to say construction grammar really, but there is a branch of constructional, the constructional enterprise, which calls everything constructions. And when you read the text, you realize that half of the time they really mean the abstraction, but half of the time they're actually counting tokens, you know, in material. And that, I think, is really bad. So I think that was when, and that's mostly the frequency people, that they kind of tend to be wishy-washy about what constructions really are. So I think that's when construction grammarians proper started saying, okay, well, there's constructions and there's constructs. So that's how it came about, and I don't know how many people use it, but I still find it useful to at least make it clear that we need to separate them, whatever we call them. And if we call them ham sandwiches, that's fine too, as long as we know what we mean by ham sandwiches. Okay, and your second question was the constructional meaning. Okay. Do constructions always have to have a unpredictable, you said, or idiosyncratic meaning? Right. Well, the answer by definition is yes. I mean, it's not a construction if it doesn't have something that is idiosyncratic, non-compositional. The question is what we mean by non-compositional. And personally also, I've been angry many times about how people kind of toss this about without being really careful about what they mean by it. So, construction can be compositional, fully compositional in the semantic sense. Okay, if I say dogs bark, you know, I know what dogs mean and I know what bark means, and therefore if I put it together, I get the event. Okay, so there are these creatures who do these things. So semantically, it's fully compositional. But if I just look at it as a construction, namely subject-predicate construction, the unpredictable, the non-compositional feature of that construction is that not every combination of a noun and a verb will give me a clause, you know, a finite clause. So it's the function, it's the syntactic function that says, okay, if I have this arrangement, I am actually expressing a particular type of valence relation between a verb or a predicate and one of its valence elements. No, because, well, lexically, no, because the valence, at least in this conception, okay, so the frame gives you the valence, and it just says there is an array of valences, and they have certain meanings. But it doesn't tell you, okay, so this is the subject, this is the object, this is the other one. It's a semantic reduction of the full lexical meaning, and it has a certain expectation for being expressed in a certain way in the sentence. And the agent doesn't have to be the subject always, doesn't have to be an NP. It can be other things. It can be a PP, right? It can be an oblique function. So it's not an automatic, you don't read it off of it automatically that you'll get a subject predicate. In other words, that's the idea. So I know this is really hard to convince people of, that the quote-unquote meaning doesn't have to be very concrete. That the quote-unquote meaning or the non-compositionality may have to do very much with just syntactic relations. You know, just like with the determination business, you could ask the same question. So why is that a construction? What is the unpredictability? What is the non-compositionality? Well, the non-compositionality is that the whole thing together may behave differently from how each of its pieces would behave on its own.
I don't know, maybe someone else wants to ask, but just looking at the list of possible constructions, so there was one construction, subject-verb inversion for questions. So I guess that's pretty general construction. And what's unpredictable about?
It's not that it's unpredictable, but what is conventional, let's stick to that, because that's, I think, is really the heart of the definition. The conventional thing is that if you have a certain type of clausal expressions, you have to invert what would otherwise not be inverted. You know. And that's, I really object actually to the word meaning in it, because I think it's extremely misleading. You know, because people, when I say meaning, we usually imagine something much more specific than, let's say, a syntactic function. So to me, it's meaning/function or just function, something like that. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, go for it.
When you gave the example with much and you said it's non-compositional, isn't it just that you are using, or they are using weak meaning of compositionality? You said it's not a sum of a part, but you don't have to sum that. You can multiply them, you can do something else. So if you assume that much is subcategory, has a valency, asking for a noun, and does something with the whole thing in a certain way that allows it to combine with, whatever it was, snow, and, so that you can shovel it, then it's pretty compositional, isn't it?
Well, again, semantically, it is compositional. If I know what much means and what snow means, then fine. I'm fine semantically. I know exactly what the phrase means. What is non-compositional here is that you have, you know what? I wonder if I have it somewhere. I might. A full picture of it. Okay, if you can bear with this. No, I don't have it here. Okay, sorry. When you combine those two, certain constraints apply. One constraint is that they have to agree in configuration, as they call it. That is mass count. You can't combine much with a count noun, for example, and vice versa. So that's one semantic property along which they have to agree. Another one they have to agree in is number. So you cannot combine singular with plural and vice versa. So you cannot say these window, right. And the third one is something that is called boundedness, which has to do with actually the intersection of these two, how the interplay. Because, for example, bare plurals behave just like mass nouns in certain ways. They don't require a determiner, right? And conceptually, when you say shoes, I bought shoes. I don't know how many shoes, or, clean up. First you have to clean up shoes, and then you do other things, and so it's just a mess, basically. The plural, the bare plural creates something that is not bounded in the way that the shoe or a shoe is. Or even the snow. If I say, have you cleared the snow? It's totally, coherent to ask, well, did you mean all of it? Because when I say the snow, or, did you clean up, did you sort it out the shoes? You can say, well, not all of them. It's way too many. It'll take me 3 days. So obviously you are taking it as a unit once you put the there. Okay. So we cannot just say it's count mass, and it's not just singular plural. It's actually, it goes across. Because you manipulate these two, by putting or not putting the determiner there. Okay. So they have to agree along these criteria. All of them are part of the description of the phrase. But what's important is that if you have singular determiner, singular noun, you'll end up with a singular phrase, nothing else, right? So then it's totally compositional in that sense, even on the abstract level. If you have count and count, then you will not end up with non-count. But what matters is the boundedness, because you may start with unbounded much and unbounded snow, and yet it doesn't give you unbounded much snow. The result is bounded, and the evidence for that is precisely in the syntax, that there are certain slots that require a bounded entity that can be taken as a whole, as a unit. And even though you start with two words that are not inherently bounded, once you put them together, you have it, you go. So that's where the non-compositionality is in this sense. That just by adding the features of the two pieces doesn't percolate, so to speak, into the same features at the top. No? So it is a different...
I was, the first time I saw analysis of these kind of things, it was in categorical grammar, Barbara Party, David Doughty. It's hard to imagine somebody more compositional than these two people. So, but I don't know all the details. So.
It's a different way of treating compositionality. And again, it's self-inflicted very often that, people didn't bother to explain what they mean by non-compositional. Partly, again, it's historical, because the original research was very much about idioms. So everything was non-compositional, and it was clear to everybody. So nobody bothered to explain, but gradually you get into regular grammar, and these questions come up, of course. So I hope I convince you, but if I didn't, I totally understand why not.
Thanks.
Thank you. So are there further questions? I have one or two. One is very general, and maybe it's not a good question actually. how many considerations, if at all, are given in constructional grammar to the notion of universality?
That's another good question, yes.
That's one question. And the other is that in your why don't you examples, it seemed to me that you somehow cross over from grammar to speech acts or whatever things. So my question would be, would you say that these things also belong to grammar? When you say lexicon and grammar, and so is it inside grammar or is it somewhere?
Yeah, these are all big questions. Okay, universality first. Going back to something I said at the beginning, again, let's just remind ourselves, this was sort of a reaction to transformation grammar, which basically started as a search for universals, right? So construction grammar from the beginning kind of took the opposite and said, well, yes, sure, we agree that all speakers have the same brains, and no matter what language we speak, we are able to learn it. So yes, we agree there's something universal about our ability to acquire any random language. But before we can say anything about what actually specifically is universal, we are going to do some research. We are not going to assume that certain categories, just because they are very frequent, are going to be universal. So there was an explicit kind of push away from saying, okay, we assume that verbs are a universal category, or subject is a universal category. So there was a pretty strong connection right from the beginning between this enterprise and between typology, which also stood in really stark contrast and conflict, actually, to the transformational view. So let's just first see what we can kind of generalize by looking at enough data, and then we can say what's universal. But gradually, of course, this became less vague and less empty, because a lot of research has been done in psychology and in cognitive sciences. And so now the universal question basically is framed in the universal cognitive endowment that we all have, which has to do then with the kinds of explanations that this theory is looking for, or where do we look for explanations? That's the way to say it. So, what is universal is our ability and need to be able to categorize, our ability to allocate memory in some efficient ways, our ability to plan ahead, our ability to evaluate and assess causal relations. And these are all things that we need independently of language. That's just part of our cognitive endowment, and language takes advantage of it. I mean, it just recycles that too, as opposed to claiming that language is a specialized ability that sits in its own organ someplace and it's completely independent of all of this general cognitive, the general cognitive ability. So that's a huge difference. And so the universality really is seen partly in the cognitive apparatus that humans have, and explanations are therefore looked for in that pool of possibilities. And more now also what comes into play is the communicative needs, because there's also something, and this comes more from the research on apes, for example, and baboons and all these creatures, where we cannot talk about language, but we definitely can see that there is a social hierarchy, there are social conventions that are followed by the whole troop. And that kind of is very similar to what we have in language as certain expectations that if I ask you a question, the expectation on both sides is that you will try to come up with an answer, right? Or if I tell you to go and do something, the expectation is that there will be a certain type of reaction. That's non-linguistic, or not necessarily linguistic. So there are certain expectations in the social arrangement, because we are basically social creatures, not individual creatures. And so another source of explanations that could be pretty universal would be in there. Okay, no matter what language we are looking at, no matter what society we are looking at, certain needs will be the same. We need to exchange information, we need to schmooze, we need to look for support, we need to ask questions and all of that, and there are certain rules or certain conventions about how we do it. So that's the universal part, which is not very concrete, obviously, but no construction grammarian would be caught ever saying that, okay, verbs are a universal category. No, expressing events, yes, but how we do it is a different story. And the second question that was equally difficult, yes, how much I am willing to put into grammar. Yeah, I do get this question occasionally. I am fairly conservative, actually, and I do draw a line to what I still would consider part of grammar, although fairly widely conceived grammar. But then there are also people who will just say, well, everything is grammar. I mean, language is grammar. I think that's unhelpful. But the line I draw is, if something is conventional, if something is of the kind where I can say, well, speakers of this community know this subconsciously and act on it, and everybody expects that this is how it's going to be, then it is part of their linguistic knowledge. If grammar is just syntax, then of course the answer to your question is no. But if grammar is a conventional system for communication, then it stretches the boundary a little bit. And so for me to say, well, if every speaker of English knows automatically that this form is associated not with what the beginning of the sentence indicates simply by its syntax, but is actually something else in terms of its pragmatic force, then it is part of what that structure is. It's part of the knowledge that the speaker has about this why don't you. Because if he only knew that why don't you wear shoes covers all of this, then communication would fail pretty quickly. But if he knows that also there is intonation, which I didn't even talk about, so that also is associated with it, which is a kind of formal signal. So anything that's conventional, I would say it's part of the linguistic knowledge that speakers show in communication. Whether I call it grammar with a lower G or capital G or something entirely different, again, but conceptually this is how I see it.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I see no hands, which means, I don't know whether conventionally or non-conventionally, that we have to say thank you to Professor Fried and to ask her or tell her or invite her for other seminars to be here and to be present with us at our seminar. So thank you again very much for coming.